Hamish McRae, why we're going for cheap money. The markets are a bit scared by interest rates. At the end of last year, they were confident that falling inflation would clear the way for central banks to cut rates fairly soon, with the US Federal Reserve doing so, possibly as early as March. Other central banks, including the Bank of England, will follow suit. The debate was about how many cuts there would be this year: 3, 4 or more. This optimism triggered a rally in bond markets, as a result of which the yield on 10-year US Treasury bonds fell to 3.8%, and the yield on 10-year gilts UK government bonds was less than 3.5%. This drop in the value of long-term money in the UK, we saw the prospect that lower debt obligations would mean that Jeremy Hunt would have more room for tax cuts in the March 6 budget and a war to lower mortgage rates. This led to Barclays offering 4.1% per annum for a 2-year period and Santander 3.89% for a 5-year period. These deals have just been announced, so I expect them to last for a while, but last week the skies turned a little dark. Perhaps inflation will not fall as fast as hoped. Central banks may have to postpone rate cuts. Thus, the yield on 10-year US bonds rose to almost 4% and gilts to about 3.8%. This is not panic, but rather the realization that the path back to somewhat cheaper money will be thorny and difficult. It's easy to list what can go wrong. The conflict in the Red Sea increases transportation costs and will slow down, and maybe reverse, the decline in inflation. Government deficits everywhere must be funded. The pile of debt accumulated by central banks under the quantitative easing program should be sold back to the public. From now on, this is quantitative tightening. Companies that are used to cheap debt face the same difficulties as people who have taken out cheap mortgages, which now have to be extended. We keep hearing the R word, recession, emerging in the US, Europe and the UK. You don't have to believe in the deep gloom of the grandees attending the Davos Forum this week to admit that this year is going to be difficult. We will hear a lot of this in the next few days. But then, as in our housing market, gloomy forecasts continue to turn out to be overly pessimistic. Smart people, or at least too many of them, keep making mistakes. We must admit that we are in the early stages of the transition from very low interest rates to normal ones. For many people, this is a new experience, and it applies to both market professionals and all of us. Getting used to these new conditions will take at least another couple of years. We don't know how to evaluate things. You can see how this manifests itself in the assessments of American high-tech giants. Last week, Microsoft briefly surpassed Apple and became the most valuable company in the world. But are they really worth almost $3 trillion, too? $35 trillion apiece? These are great companies, but it takes a lot of effort from their management to justify the fact that their market capitalization is greater than that of all companies in the FTSE 100 index. Now that investors can finally get reasonable yields on bonds, they undoubtedly have a role to play in shaping balanced portfolios. Indeed, the main conclusion that I have drawn from these last weeks is that you cannot choose the right time with bonds, just like with stocks. From time to time, there comes a period when markets clearly overreact. An example of this was the drop in the number of subscribers from 7,400 on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 to below 5,200 4 weeks later. But in most cases, there is a reasonable balance between optimists and pessimists, and the fluctuations we are seeing now in the bond markets are the new normal. This leads to a conclusion for Hunt. He may have more room to change the budget than he expected when he prepared his autumn statement in November, but he should not expect it to be huge. And the message for anyone who has to roll over a mortgage is that if they can borrow less than 4% for 5 years, they get the money almost as cheaply as Hunt. Their credit is almost as good as that of His Majesty's government. This should be a modest consolation in these difficult times.